The unthinkable reward. The great hall of the Zorvan High Council was silent. Golden lights flickered along the walls, casting eerie shadows on the towering alien figures seated in a circle. Their eyes, deep and unreadable, fixed on one man standing at the center, Captain Daniel Cross. Daniel stood tall, his battle-worn uniform still carrying the dust of war. His muscles ached, his mind exhausted, but he refused to show weakness. He had fought alongside humans and Zorvans against the ruthless Xygran Empire, defeating an enemy that had terrorized entire star systems. Tonight was supposed to be a night of honor, a night of rewards. A Zorvan elder stepped forward, his long robes shimmering under the light. His voice was smooth yet cold. "Human warrior, you have earned the highest gift of our people, a prize worthy of your strength." Daniel exhaled slowly. He had heard rumors about Zorvan rewards, riches, land, even powerful weapons. But when the elder clapped his hands, the doors at the far end of the hall opened, and something unexpected happened. A woman stepped forward. She was not human. Her silver-blue skin gleamed under the lights. Her long dark hair cascaded down her back, and her bright violet eyes held a mixture of fear and confusion. The golden band was wrapped around her wrists, a mark of ownership. She looked young but regal, her posture tense, as if preparing for something terrible. "This is Syrah," the elder declared. "She is yours now, our gift to you." The hall erupted in applause. The Zorvans watched with pride, expecting their gift to be accepted without question. Daniel's jaw tightened. He stared at the woman, then at the council. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. They had given him a living being. He turned to the elder, his voice sharp. "She's not a thing. She's a person." The clapping stopped. The room grew deathly quiet. The Zorvans exchanged confused looks. The elder frowned. "She is our way of honoring you. She belongs to you now." Syrah stood motionless, her gaze flickering between Daniel and the council. Something in her eyes. It wasn't just fear. It was pleading. Daniel clenched his fists. He had seen many horrors in war. Cities burning, soldiers dying, innocent people suffering. But this was something else. He took a deep breath, his voice firm. "No." Gasps filled the hall. Some Zorvans looked offended, others shocked. The elder's face darkened. "You reject our gift." His voice was colder now. Daniel didn't hesitate. "I don't take people as rewards. This is wrong." A low murmur spread through the council chamber. Some of the Zorvans whispered among themselves, while others glared at Daniel as if he had committed an unspeakable crime. Syrah's lips parted slightly. She looked at him as if she couldn't believe what she just heard. The elder's tone sharpened. "You insult our tradition, human. This is a great honor." Daniel stood his ground. "Maybe to you, but not to me." The room tensed. The air felt heavy, like a storm was about to break. The elder turned to Syrah. "Step forward." She obeyed, her movements slow, uncertain. The elder looked back at Daniel. "Take her hand. Accept the reward, and this will be over." Daniel shook his head. "I said no." A cold silence followed. The elder's expression darkened even more. Then Syrah did something unexpected. She grabbed Daniel's hand, but not in surrender. She tightened her grip, leaned in, and whispered words that sent chills down his spine. "You have no idea what you just did. They will come for us." Daniel's heart pounded. The Zorvans didn't react to her words as if they hadn't heard them. But the fear in Syrah's eyes was real. Something bigger was happening here. Something dangerous. The elder's voice boomed across the hall. "You have made a foolish choice, Captain Cross." Daniel didn't flinch. He stared straight into the elder's eyes. "We'll see about that." The Zorvan warriors in the room tensed. The mood had changed. This was no longer a celebration. This was a warning. Daniel didn't know what was coming next, but one thing was clear. He had just made a powerful enemy. The price of defiance. Daniel stood tall, his heartbeat steady despite the storm brewing around him. The grand hall of the Zorvan High Council no longer felt like a place of honor. It was a cage, a den of serpents. The moment he had refused their gift, the air had shifted. He could see it in the eyes of the alien leaders, the flicker of disbelief turning into something far more dangerous. Syra's grip on his wrist was firm, but her hands were cold, trembling slightly. Her violet eyes darted across the chamber, watching the Zorvans, waiting for the moment everything would turn. The elder stepped forward, his golden robes flowing behind him like liquid metal. His deep, resonant voice cut through the silence. "Captain Cross, do you truly understand what you have done?" Daniel exhaled sharply, keeping his stance strong. "I understand perfectly." The elder's face darkened. "Then you are either arrogant or a fool." A low murmur spread through the chamber as other Zorvans whispered among themselves. Some were angry, others merely intrigued, like predators watching a wounded animal, deciding whether it was worth the effort to pounce. Daniel ignored them and turned slightly toward Syra. She was still clutching his wrist, but now her fingers were shaking. "They will come for us." Her whisper echoed in his head. "Who?" He murmured back, keeping his face unreadable. Syra hesitated, her breath quickening. "Not here. Not now." The elder clapped his hands, and suddenly the heavy doors of the chamber slammed shut with a deep metallic clang. The sound reverberated through the room like a war drum. Daniel didn't need to look to know what was happening. He could hear the shift in movement, the subtle scrape of armored boots on the polished floor, the quiet hum of energy weapons being powered up. They weren't going to let him walk away from this. A Zorvan guard stepped forward, his crystalline armor catching the dim light. He held a long staff tipped with a glowing blue edge, a plasma spear. Daniel tensed. The elder spoke again, voice like steel. "This is your last chance, Captain Cross. Take her hand, accept your reward, and all will be forgiven." Daniel could feel the weight of every eye in the chamber. He knew what was happening. They weren't just punishing him for rejecting their tradition. They were testing him. Would he submit, or would he resist? His fingers twitched at his side. Every instinct screamed at him to act, to move, to fight. But Syra's grip tightened again, and this time she shook her head, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "Wait." Daniel clenched his jaw. "I already gave you my answer." The elder's eyes turned cold. "Then you leave us no choice." With a sharp motion of his hand, he gave the order. The guard surged forward. The escape. Daniel had been in enough fights to know when he was outnumbered. 10 guards, plasma weapons, closed space, bad odds. But odds had never stopped him before. The first guard lunged with his spear. Daniel sidestepped, grabbed the weapon's shaft, and twisted it hard. The guard barely had time to react before Daniel's elbow smashed into his jaw, sending him sprawling. Before the others could react, Daniel swung the stolen plasma spear in a wide arc, knocking 2 more guards back. Their armor was tough, but their footing was weak. He used that. Another guard came at him from the side, but Daniel ducked low, using the momentum to sweep his legs out from under him. The alien crashed to the ground with a metallic thud. A plasma bolt seared past his head, and Daniel instinctively pulled Syra close, shielding her. The elder watched, his expression unreadable. "Resisting is useless, Captain." Daniel ignored him. He turned his head, searching for a way out. The doors were locked. The windows were reinforced. The only way out was through. More guards rushed in. Too many. He wouldn't last. Then, a sudden flash of light. A brilliant white pulse filled the chamber, blinding everyone for a split second. Daniel felt Syra pull him hard, and before he could react, she pressed something cold against his palm. A small metallic device. She whispered one word, "Run." Then she slammed her hand onto the device. A shockwave of energy exploded outward, knocking the guards off their feet, Daniel barely had time to process what was happening before Sira yanked him forward. She was fast. Faster than he expected. They tore through the chamber, weaving between dazed guards. The doors remained sealed, but Sira didn't hesitate. She reached for a panel on the wall and slammed her fist into it. A hidden passageway slid open. Without thinking, they dove inside. The last thing Daniel saw before the doors slammed shut behind them was the elder's face, calm, but with a knowing smile. This wasn't over. A dangerous truth. The tunnel was dark, the air thick with dust, and the scent of metal. Daniel ran beside Sira, his mind racing. "What the hell just happened?" he hissed. Sira kept moving. "You don't know what you've stepped into, human." "Then explain." She hesitated. For the first time since their escape, she turned to him fully. Her violet eyes were filled with something more than fear. Guilt. "I wasn't a gift, Daniel. I was a problem they needed to get rid of." Daniel exhaled sharply. "I figured that much out already." She shook her head. "No, you don't understand. They didn't expect you to refuse. They expected you to accept. And once you did," her voice lowered, "you would have been the one to kill me." Daniel felt his pulse stop. Sira swallowed hard. "The moment you accepted me, the moment I belonged to you, they would have activated the failsafe." Daniel's mind raced. It all made sense now. The golden band on her wrists, the strange tension in the room, the elder's calmness. They had never meant for him to keep her. They had meant for him to execute her without knowing it. Daniel's fists clenched. "Why? What are you to them?" Sira exhaled, looking down at the band on her wrists. "I am the last of something they want to erase." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it sent a chill down Daniel's spine. Then from deep within the tunnel, a distant, echoing sound. Footsteps. They weren't alone. Sira turned, urgency flashing across her face. "They're already coming." Daniel drew a deep breath, steeling himself. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. A forbidden truth. The tunnel stretched before them like the throat of a beast, dark, winding, and suffocating. The walls were damp, made of some alien alloy that hummed faintly under Daniel's fingertips. The air was thick with an electric charge, the kind that made his instincts scream trap. Sira ran ahead of him, her silver-blue skin glowing faintly in the dim light. Daniel's mind was still spinning from what she had just told him. "I wasn't a gift, Daniel. I was a problem they needed to get rid of. They expected you to accept me and then kill me without knowing it." The words clung to his thoughts like a parasite, writhing and burrowing deeper. He had been set up. But for what purpose? And why had they assumed he would simply accept? Behind them, the tunnel trembled with distant footsteps. Their pursuers were moving fast. "How far does this tunnel go?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Sira didn't slow down. "Far enough to get us outside the city walls. If we make it." That wasn't exactly reassuring. Daniel glanced over his shoulder. Shadows flickered in the dim light. The Zorvan guards weren't running. They didn't need to. They knew something he didn't. And that made his gut twist. "Sira, if this is an escape tunnel, why aren't they chasing us faster?" She didn't answer. Instead, she stopped so suddenly that he nearly crashed into her. "We have a problem." Daniel followed her gaze and felt his stomach drop. Ahead of them, the tunnel split into 3 different paths. The walls shimmered with strange, shifting symbols, their meaning unknown to him. "You don't know which way to go, do you?" Sira's jaw clenched. "They must have reconfigured the tunnels. They don't want us getting out." Of course, the Zorvans had planned for this. Trap. Daniel scanned the 3 paths, trying to think. He had no map, no clue where any of these tunnels led. They could take the wrong turn and end up walking straight into the enemy's hands. Then, a sound. Low, mechanical. A hiss of pressurized air. Daniel barely had time to react before the ceiling behind them shifted. A massive metallic door slammed down, sealing the passage they had come from. They were cut off. Sira sucked in a breath. They're forcing us forward. Daniel gritted his teeth, which means we're already playing their game. The Zorvans weren't in a rush to chase them. That was the terrifying part. They were herding them, guiding them like rats through a maze. And that meant only one tunnel led to freedom. The others, death. The choice. Sira stepped toward the symbols on the walls, tracing them with her fingers. These are old. Pre-Empire. My people used these before the Zorvans rewrote history. Daniel folded his arms. Can you read them? A flicker of frustration crossed her face. I can try. Her fingers danced over the markings, her violet eyes narrowing in concentration. Daniel resisted the urge to check behind them again. He could feel the Zorvans watching, waiting. Sira suddenly stopped. Her hand hovered over one of the symbols, a spiral with an eye at its center. This one. Daniel frowned. How do you know? Sira hesitated, then turned to him, voice barely above a whisper. Because it doesn't belong here. A chill crept down his spine. Sira, what exactly are you? She swallowed hard. Not here. We need to move. Now. She pushed forward into the tunnel, and Daniel followed. Every muscle in his body tensed. The walls here were different, older. The metallic hum was softer, but there was something else, something alive. Then, as they moved deeper, Daniel began to see carvings. Figures, strange and humanoid, kneeling before something vast and shadowy. A presence with no face, only a gaping void where its head should be. Sira's pace quickened. She refused to look at the carvings, but Daniel noticed the way her hands shook. He didn't ask. Not yet. The tunnel twisted downward, and then the air changed. It was colder here, heavier. And at the end of the passage, a massive door loomed before them. Not a normal door. A vault. It pulsed with energy. Symbols ran along its surface, shifting and writhing as if they were alive. Sira reached out to touch it. And then, the lights in the tunnel died. Complete, suffocating darkness. A whisper slid through the air, low, curling, and inhuman. Daniel's instincts screamed danger. Then something moved. Behind them. A shape, tall, unnatural, and watching. Sira's breath hitched. They're here. The truth comes out. Daniel's hand went to his sidearm. Who? Sira turned, pressing her back against the vault, her violet eyes wide. Not Zorvans. Daniel tightened his grip on his weapon. He couldn't see the thing in the dark, but he could feel it. A presence older than the Zorvans, older than humanity. And then, just as suddenly as the darkness had fallen, a voice. Not spoken, not heard, but felt. You should not have come here, human. The words weren't Zorvan. They weren't spoken in any language Daniel knew. But somehow he understood. His breath turned shallow. His pulse slammed against his ribs. Sira's voice was barely above a whisper. We have to open the vault. Daniel swallowed. Why? What's inside? She turned to him, eyes shining in the dark. The only thing that can stop them. A cold weight settled in his gut. And who exactly are them? Sira hesitated. Then, in a voice barely audible, she spoke one word. A name. And when she did, the whispering in the darkness stopped. The air thickened. Because whoever, or whatever, was in the dark had just heard it, too. Daniel barely had time to react before the vault began to open. And then, everything changed. Hunted by the Empire. The vault door groaned as ancient mechanisms ground against each other, releasing a gust of stale air that smelled of metal, dust, and something else. Something old. The symbols along the edges pulsed like a dying heartbeat, fading in and out of existence. Daniel took a step back, his instincts screaming at him. Something was wrong. Behind them, The whispering presence in the dark had gone silent. Not gone, just waiting. Sira clenched her fists, her breathing unsteady. Daniel turned to her. "You're sure about this?" She swallowed. "No, not exactly comforting." The vault door yawned open, revealing a chamber unlike anything Daniel had ever seen. It wasn't just old, it felt forgotten. Towering stone walls stretched high, etched with carvings depicting creatures that defied logic. Their bodies twisted in impossible shapes, their faces absent, only gaping voids where eyes should be. The ceiling was not a ceiling at all, but a swirling black void, dotted with tiny stars, as if the chamber was floating in the abyss of space itself. And at the center of the room stood a pedestal. Upon it lay a cube, pulsing softly with an eerie, shifting glow. Sira inhaled sharply. "It's real." Daniel's gaze flicked to her. "What is?" She stepped forward, eyes fixed on the cube. "The core of Syros. The weapon the Zorvans have been hiding for centuries." Daniel's pulse quickened. "Weapon?" Sira reached out, hesitated, then pulled her hand back. "Not exactly. More like a key to something far worse." Daniel exhaled slowly. "Start talking." Sira tore her gaze from the cube and faced him. "The Zorvans didn't create their empire." Daniel frowned. "What are you talking about?" Sira's eyes darkened. "They took it. From something older. Something that should have been left alone." She gestured to the carvings on the walls. "These aren't just decorations. They're warnings." Daniel took a closer look. The figures in the carvings weren't Zorvan. They weren't even humanoid. They were twisted, towering creatures with elongated limbs and empty faces. Sira's voice was barely a whisper. "The ones who came before. The ones the Zorvans stole from." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "You're saying the Zorvans wiped out an entire species and took their empire?" Sira nodded. "Yes, but they didn't just kill them." She turned to the cube. "They trapped them." A silence stretched between them. Daniel clenched his jaw. "You mean to tell me that thing is keeping something locked away?" Sira exhaled shakily. "And the Zorvans have been using it to power their empire. Their technology, their ships, their weapons. It all comes from siphoning energy from something they barely understand." Daniel ran a hand down his face. "And you want to take it?" Sira hesitated, then nodded. "We don't have a choice. If we don't, the Zorvans will use it to wipe out entire species, just like they did before." Daniel stared at the cube. He'd seen power corrupt entire civilizations, but this was something far worse. His gut twisted with unease. "If we take it, what happens?" Sira's lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't know. Great, just great." Before Daniel could respond, a deep rumbling shook the chamber. Dust rained down from the walls, and from the tunnel behind them, a sound. Not whispers, not voices. Footsteps. Heavy. Marching. Armed. Daniel's instincts flared to life. He grabbed Sira's arm. "Time's up. We need to move. Now." She nodded, and without another word, she reached for the cube. The moment her fingers touched it, the air in the chamber shifted. The carvings on the walls began to move. The once still figures twisted and writhed, their hollow faces turning toward Sira. The chamber groaned, as if the very stone was alive, and in pain. Daniel pulled out his weapon, even though he wasn't sure what he'd be shooting at. Sira gasped as the cube pulsed violently, sending a shockwave rippling through the chamber. The ground cracked beneath their feet. And then, a terrible sound, a distant, inhuman scream. Not from the tunnel. From above. Daniel's breath hitched. He looked up. The void in the ceiling was no longer empty. Something was looking back. The pursuit. "Move." Daniel grabbed Sira just as the tunnel behind them exploded. Shards of stone flew in all directions. The force sent them sprawling across the chamber floor. Through the smoke, figures emerged, Zorvan soldiers in full battle armor. Daniel swore under his breath. They had walked right into an ambush. A commanding voice rang out. "Captain Cross, surrender the girl and the artifact." Now, Daniel turned to see General Cyroth, the Zorvan warlord who had led the council meeting. His towering form gleamed in the dim light, his golden armor unmarred by battle. His eyes, cold and reptilian, flickered to Sira. "You should not have touched that." Sira held the cube tightly against her chest. "Your people don't deserve this power." Cyroth's lips curled into a smirk. "And you do." Daniel knew how this would go. The moment they gave up the cube, they were dead. He raised his weapon. Not happening. Cyroth exhaled, almost as if he was disappointed. Then he gestured with one hand. The soldiers opened fire. The escape. Daniel shoved Sira behind a broken column as plasma bolts burned through the air. "Stay down," he barked, returning fire. He took out 2 soldiers with precise shots, but more poured in. They had numbers, and Daniel knew he couldn't win in a firefight. He turned to Sira. "We need a way out. Now." She looked at the cube, then at the carvings on the walls. Her face paled. "There is one way." Daniel knew that tone. He didn't like it. "What is it?" She hesitated. Then she grabbed his hand and slammed the cube against the pedestal. A blinding pulse of energy surged outward. The walls of the chamber shattered, revealing an endless abyss beyond. Cyroth's eyes widened. "No, you don't understand what you're doing." Sira didn't listen. She turned to Daniel. "Jump." Daniel stared at the abyss. "You've got to be kidding me." Plasma fire erupted behind them. Sira grabbed his hand. "Trust me." Daniel didn't have time to think. He jumped. The last thing he heard was Cyroth's enraged roar as the Zorvan Empire's darkest secret swallowed them whole. The secret weapon. The fall was unlike anything Daniel had ever experienced. Not air, not gravity, just nothing. A vast emptiness stretched around him, swallowing light, sound, and even the familiar sensation of falling. There was no wind against his skin, no rush of air past his ears. Only a slow, sinking motion, as if he were being pulled downward by something unseen. And then, suddenly, he hit solid ground. Daniel gasped, lungs heaving as he tried to steady himself. His body ached, but he was alive. That was something. Beside him, Sira landed with the grace of someone who had done this before. She rose to her feet, cradling the cube against her chest. Daniel pushed himself up and looked around. Wherever they were, it wasn't natural. The sky above them wasn't a sky at all, but an infinite stretch of swirling black, speckled with pinpricks of shifting red stars. The landscape was even worse. Twisted ruins of alien architecture, broken and warped, stretching into the void as if melted by something beyond comprehension. A graveyard, not of people, but of civilizations. Daniel exhaled sharply. Where the hell are we? Sira's grip on the cube tightened, the place the Zorvans never wanted anyone to find. Daniel turned to her, eyes narrowing. "Start explaining. Now." Sira hesitated, then sighed. "This is Kairos, or what's left of it." Daniel frowned. "Xyros? That's the name of the cube, right?" She shook her head. "No. Kairos was a world. A powerful one. It existed long before the Zorvans claimed their empire." She knelt, running her fingers over the cracked ground, where faint, glowing symbols pulsed beneath the surface. The Zorvans didn't conquer Kairos. She turned to face him, her violet eyes dark with something that looked dangerously close to fear. They tried to erase it. Daniel clenched his jaw. "Why?" Sira rose to her feet, brushing dust from her hands. "Because Kairos held a power unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. A force beyond science, beyond logic, something that could shape reality itself." She gestured to the cube. "This is a fragment of that power. A fragment they tried to control." Daniel exhaled, shaking his head. So you're telling me the Zorvans wiped out an entire world, stole its technology, and built their empire on top of it? Sarah gave a grim nod. And they've been keeping that power buried ever since. Daniel looked back at the ruins, a sick realization settling in. Then why the hell did we come here? Sarah met his gaze. Because the Zorvans are going to use this power again. The weapon awakens. Daniel's pulse quickened. Use it for what? Sarah's expression hardened. To end humanity. Silence hung between them. Daniel felt his chest tighten. You're sure? She turned toward the ruins. The Zorvans have always feared humanity. Your people fight too hard, survive too much. They see you as a threat. Daniel exhaled sharply. So what? They're going to wipe us out just because we don't roll over and die. Sarah nodded. The Zorvans don't take chances. They see your people as dangerous, unpredictable. They can't afford another war, so they won't start one. Her voice dropped lower. They'll end it before it begins. Daniel clenched his fists. And this cube, it's their way of doing that. Sarah hesitated, then shook her head. Not exactly. She turned, stepping toward a massive, ruined structure in the distance, something that looked eerily like a temple. The cube isn't the weapon. It's just the key. A cold weight settled in Daniel's gut. Key to what? Sarah exhaled. The last thing the Tyrosians built before they disappeared. A shiver crawled down Daniel's spine. You mean before the Zorvans killed them? Sarah's expression was unreadable. No. She looked up at the twisting ruins, her voice barely a whisper. The Zorvans didn't kill them. They killed themselves. Daniel stiffened. Why? Sarah turned back to the temple, gripping the cube. Because they knew what was coming. And then, the ground trembled. Daniel immediately raised his weapon. Tell me that was just an earthquake. Sarah didn't answer. Instead, she took off toward the temple at full speed. The heart of Tyros. Daniel followed, dodging jagged debris as the tremors grew worse. The ruins shuddered, the black sky rippled, and a distant, deep hum began to fill the air. Something was waking up. They reached the temple, if it could even be called that. The structure was massive, but the architecture was wrong, as if it hadn't been built by hands, but rather grown from the ground itself. The entrance loomed before them, a massive circular door lined with glowing symbols. Sarah didn't hesitate. She slammed the cube into the center of the door. The moment it connected, the symbols flared to life. The hum in the air became a roar. And then, the door split open. A pulse of energy erupted outward, sending Daniel stumbling back. The temple groaned, shaking loose ancient dust and debris. And from within, a new sound. A heartbeat. Deep, slow, alive. Daniel barely had time to react before something stepped out of the darkness. Tall, silent, impossible. It wasn't a machine, wasn't a Zorvan. It wasn't even alive. And yet, when it turned its featureless face toward them, Daniel felt it looking at him. Sarah's breath caught. Daniel's grip tightened on his weapon. Sarah, he said slowly, voice tight. What the hell is that? She swallowed. The last defense of Cyros. The creature tilted its head. Then, in a voice that wasn't spoken but felt inside their minds, it spoke. You have awakened us. Why? Sarah squared her shoulders. Because the Zorvans are coming, and we need your help. The being was silent for a long, terrifying moment. Then it turned toward Daniel. Human. Daniel stiffened. Are you ready to finish what your ancestors started? Before Daniel could answer, the ruins shook again. Distantly, high above, the sky split open. Daniel's stomach dropped. The Zorvans had found them. And they were bringing an army. The final war begins. The last stand. The sky split apart. From the swirling black void above, massive Zorvan warships emerged like predatory beasts, their angular forms blotting out the strange, red-lit stars. Dozens of them. No, hundreds. A full-scale invasion force. Daniel's pulse hammered. The Zorvans hadn't come to negotiate. They had come to end this. He turned to Sira, who stood frozen at the temple's entrance, her grip tight around the cube. Her silver-blue skin had gone pale, her violet eyes wide with a mix of fear and something else. Determination. And beside her, the impossible being from the vault stood motionless, watching, waiting. It had no mouth, no face, no true form, yet Daniel could feel its presence pressing against his mind, coiling around his thoughts like a whisper that hadn't yet been spoken. Then it moved. Not walked, shifted. One moment it was beside Sira. The next it was in front of Daniel, towering over him like a shadow given form. The space around it bent slightly, like the air itself was struggling to exist in its presence. They are here. The voice didn't come from the creature. It came from inside Daniel's head. His body tensed instinctively. He had faced warlords, pirates, alien beasts. But this was something else. Daniel took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. You said my ancestors started this war. What did you mean? The being's head tilted. Then, suddenly, a flood of images. They weren't memories. They weren't visions. They were something older. Daniel saw a world. Zyros, before it was ruins. Towering structures that defied logic, twisting into the sky like living stone. A civilization unlike any other, their power not drawn from machines, but from the very fabric of existence. Then came the war. The Zorvans, once a lesser race, discovered Tyros. They were afraid. They saw the power of the Xyrosians not as something to learn from, but something to control. And so they attacked. Daniel saw it unfold, the Zorvan fleets descending, bombarding the world with fire and fury. But the Xyrosians didn't fight back with weapons. They fought back with something worse. Reality itself bent at their will. The Zorvans didn't just lose ships. They lost time, lost existence. And yet, the Xyrosians still fell. Not because they were defeated, but because they chose to erase themselves. Daniel staggered back, breath shaking. You killed yourselves. The being nodded. To stop what was coming. Daniel's stomach twisted. Something worse. Something that even the Zorvans feared. Before he could ask, the sky tore open further. A deep mechanical roar shook the air as Zorvan drop pods descended like fireballs from the sky. Within seconds, the ruined landscape was swarming with soldiers. Hundreds, thousands, all armed, all advancing. At the front, stepping down from a gilded warship, was General Tyroth. His golden armor gleamed in the crimson light, his reptilian eyes locking onto Daniel and Sira with a chilling, calculated expression. You've run far enough. His voice echoed through the battlefield. Surrender the girl. Surrender the artifact. And perhaps you will die quickly. Daniel lowered his weapon. Not in surrender, but in calculation. Because if the Zorvans had come with everything they had, that meant they were afraid. Daniel glanced at Sira. She met his gaze, clutching the cube tightly. They had one chance. One move left to play. Sira, Daniel said quietly, can you wake it up? She hesitated, eyes flicking toward the towering being beside them. Then she nodded. I can try. Then do it. Sira turned, raising the cube high, unleashing the power of Zyros. The moment the cube connected with the pedestal inside the temple, the entire world shook. A shockwave of white-hot energy erupted outward, slamming into the advancing Zorvan soldiers like a hurricane. Some were lifted off their feet, hurled into the void. Others were ripped apart at the atomic level, vanishing into nothing. Zyroth stumbled back, his golden cape whipping wildly in the storm. No, he roared. You don't understand what you're doing. Sira pushed harder. The cube pulsed, and for the first time in eons, Zyros awakened. The ruins shifted. No, not shifted. They rebuilt. Ancient structures rose from the ground, reforming as if time itself was reversing. Walls snapped back into place, towers reassembled themselves, entire cities began to return from dust. And then, they appeared. Not machines, not monsters, but beings. The lost race of Tyros. Their bodies were luminous, woven from strands of light and shadow. Their presence was overwhelming, pressing against Daniel's mind like an ocean wave. The Zorvans froze. For the first time, Daniel saw fear in Cyroth's eyes. The general took a slow step back. "This is why we buried it." Daniel turned to Sira. "What happens now?" She exhaled, watching as the spectral figures descended from the ruins. "Now," she whispered. She turned to Daniel, her expression unreadable. "Now the war ends. The final confrontation." The battlefield fell silent. The army of Cyros, ***, not dead, not alive, but something in between, ***, stared at the Zorvans. Then they spoke. Not in words, not in sound, but in will. The Zorvan soldiers screamed. One by one, their bodies withered, twisted, and vanished, as if they had never been. The warships in the sky crumbled, their metal turning to rust, their pilots fading from existence. Daniel watched in stunned silence as the mighty Zorvan Empire began to unravel before his eyes. General Tyroth fell to his knees, watching his people disappear. Then, slowly, he turned to Daniel. His expression wasn't anger. It was resignation. "You don't realize what you've done." His body began to disintegrate, his golden armor turning to dust. His last words echoed as the wind carried him away. "You freed something far worse than us." Then, he was gone. The cost of victory. Daniel turned to Sira. "We did it." She didn't look relieved. Instead, she stared at the horizon, where the ruins of Tyros had fully returned. Her voice was quiet. "No, Daniel." She turned to face him, her violet eyes filled with something new. Something terrifying. "We just opened the first door." And behind them, deep in the heart of the temple, something began to wake up. The unthinkable choice. The world had changed. Where once there had been ruins, now stood towering structures of impossible geometry. Tyros had not merely been resurrected. It had rewritten itself. The very air shimmered with energy, charged with the raw force of something ancient and far beyond human understanding. And in the heart of it all, something stirred. Daniel Cross had seen war. He had fought battles where men bled and burned. He had seen planets crumble under the weight of their own destruction. But this was something else. Something worse. The Zorvans were gone. Not defeated, not destroyed. Erased. Their empire, their fleets, their armies had vanished as if they had never existed. The beams of Tyros had undone them in mere minutes. And yet, standing at the edge of this reborn civilization, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that they had made a terrible mistake. Sira stood beside him, gripping the now dim cube in her trembling hands. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. They both knew. This wasn't victory. This was something else, and they had just set it free. The awakening. The temple behind them groaned. A deep, resonant vibration pulsed through the ground, sending cracks rippling outward like spiderwebs. Daniel took a step back, hand instinctively reaching for his weapon, though he knew, somehow, bullets weren't going to help here. Sira exhaled sharply. "It's waking up." Daniel's throat was dry. "What is?" Sira turned to him, her violet eyes dark and distant. The thing that Tyrosians feared more than the Zorvans. She turned toward the vast cityscape that had reassembled itself before them. The thing they built their entire civilization to contain. A pulse of heatless fire surged across the landscape, illuminating the newly restored buildings. In the distance, shapes moved, tall, elegant figures of living light, flickering in and out of focus. The remnants of the Tyrosian race, reborn from the ruins. They had not spoken. Not yet. But Daniel could feel their eyes on him. Watching. Judging. And then the world shuddered. A sound, deep and impossibly old, rolled across the sky, like something vast taking its first breath. Daniel's fingers twitched at his side. "Sira, tell me we didn't just trade one enemy for another." She swallowed. "I don't know." Not the answer he wanted. The temple doors, once sealed for eons, burst open. A wave of darkness poured forth, not absence of light, but something deeper, something alive. And from within, a voice emerged. Not spoken, not heard, but felt. A whisper that slithered through their bones, sinking into their very cells. "You have done well, little things." Daniel stiffened. His breath turned shallow. Because the voice was inside him. It wasn't just speaking to him, it was unraveling him. His memories flashed before his eyes. His childhood on Earth, his first battle, his first kill, the long, lonely years of war. The voice saw everything, knew everything. Sira gasped beside him, clutching her head. She heard it too. "You have freed us, and for that, we are grateful." Daniel forced himself to breathe. He clenched his fists, grounding himself in the now. "Who are you?" The voice laughed. Not with amusement, with hunger. "We are the ones who were sealed away before time had a name." A shape emerged from the temple's depths. Not a person, not a god. Something older, something vast. Its form shifted, flickering between matter and nothingness, stretching beyond the limits of perception. One moment it was towering, another it was barely there. "We are the first, the forgotten, the ones your Zorvan masters feared." Daniel felt a cold sweat break across his skin. Sira shook her head, trembling. "The Exarosians didn't die because of the Zorvans." She turned to Daniel, her expression stricken. "They died to stop this." Daniel's stomach turned to iron. They had thought they were reviving an ancient race. Instead, they had unleashed something else entirely. Something no civilization had ever survived. The choice. The air was breaking. Daniel could feel it. Reality itself was bending around the entity's presence, distorting in ways his mind could barely comprehend. And then, it spoke again. "We have no quarrel with you, human." Its formless shape drifted closer, though it never truly moved. "Your kind was not meant to be a part of this war." Daniel's fists clenched. What war? The entity's laughter rattled through his skull. The one that never ended. Sira stepped forward, defiant despite the terror in her eyes. "You're the reason the Tyrosians destroy themselves." The entity's presence shuddered. They feared what they could not control. So they burned their own world to keep us contained. Its voice darkened. And yet here we are. Daniel's blood ran cold. This was bigger than the Zorvans, bigger than humanity. And they had set it free. The entity lowered itself until its shifting form loomed over them. "You freed us, and so we offer you this mercy." It stretched one formless limb toward Daniel. "Leave this place. Forget what you have seen, and your people will be spared." Daniel felt his heart stop. Sira's voice was sharp. "And if we refuse?" The entity smiled, or at least Daniel felt that it did. "Then we begin with Earth." A silence thicker than death filled the space between them. Sira turned to Daniel. "We can't let this happen." Daniel stared at the thing before them, at the raw power it held, at the choice before him. If he ran, humanity might survive, might be spared. But at what cost? Because if they didn't stop it here, if they didn't end it now, this thing would never stop. It would consume the stars. Daniel took a slow breath. Then he met Sira's eyes. "You still have that failsafe, don't you?" She swallowed, then nodded. Daniel turned back to the entity. His voice was steady. "No deal." The thing hissed. And then, the battle for the universe began.